Hello, friends. Father Andrew here. Can just anything be worship? That's what I want to talk about today. The question of what is worship has fascinated me probably most of my life, but I remember especially beginning when I was a young adult. And maybe for some of those of you out there who are currently young adults, this is a question on your minds as well. And when I was a young adult and in the process of becoming an Orthodox Christian, shortly before that, I belonged to the beginnings of an evangelical megachurch, right? So one of those very large churches where you're getting thousands of people on Sunday morning, and there was a rock band on stage, and there was some lighting and this kind of thing. And I wasn't raised in that. I mean, because when I was very, very young, there weren't that many of those around. But I was raised in much smaller churches, and the megachurch movement wasn't really a big thing when I was quite young. But when I was a young adult, it was certainly coming into its own in the 1990s. And I remember there was one Sunday morning where, after singing kind of the usual series of songs, at one point the worship leader, he starts having the worship team, so the singers up front, and leading everybody in the church and singing the song "Lean on Me," which is a great song. I mean, I love that song. And you start to hear someone singing that, it's hard not to sing along. Great song. But when I heard that song, I thought to myself, is this worship? Is this Christian worship? At the time, I was working as a stagehand. So I was one of those guys that was at the theater or at a concert venue, dressing all in black, somewhere in the background, helping to make things go. The sound, the lighting, the sets, all that kind of stuff. And that's what I did professionally for 10 years, actually. That's what I did right up to before I went to seminary, in fact. And I remember there was one summer in particular that, because of my job, I happened to go to, I think it was 2 different concerts by the Dave Matthews Band. And so now, of course, one of their big hits is the song Ants Marching. Okay, so probably some of you have heard it. And there's this one point in the song where the phrase is sung, "people in every direction." And it's this sort of big moment in the song. And when Dave Matthews sings that, at the time, this was in the late 90s, at the time, the lighting design for the concert, there was a bunch of lights that were facing the people, right? And they were not pointed at the stage, but they were instead pointed into the house, out on the lawn, because it's like there's a big concert venue. And suddenly those lights come on, and all the people in every direction are illumined by these lights. Just suddenly you get big lights shining in your face. At that moment, the crowd went crazy. They're just, cheering and just really, really excited. And since I was at that concert twice that summer, I noticed the exact same thing both times. People in every direction, lights come on, crowd goes crazy. Automatic, pretty much. Now, when the concert goers went to that concert, they have this thought in their heads, like, okay, at this moment, I know I'm supposed to cheer or whatever. No, they didn't know that. And it wasn't just because it was a big moment in the song. There was this immediate experience that they had of being flooded with light, and they became very emotionally excited and happy and cheered as a result. And, to a stagehand, this makes complete sense, right? The whole job is about using technical means to get people to have a certain kind of experience. Okay, so there's obviously the artists who are doing their thing, but then there's also the technical side, which enhances what the artists are doing and helps people to have a particular kind of experience. And I remember, having experienced that myself, having been involved in that, having been the guy who presses the button and watches people respond, have an emotional experience in response to me pressing a button. I remember being at church. Again, this is a mega church, and watching what was going on with that kind of professional eye, right? and looking around and seeing the people next to me having an experience. And I realized I can make them have this experience. I can do this, like through technique. I can make people have an emotional moment. And certainly within that context, people identify those emotions as being the presence of the Holy Spirit. They identify what they're doing as being worship. Now, set aside the question of whether people are sincere or not. I absolutely believe that people who are in those kind of contexts are sincere. Of course, I believe that. I have no reason to doubt that. Of course, they're sincere. But is that what worship is? Does that actually constitute worship? It's interesting if you ask the question of kind of, any Christian in America now, like what exactly is worship? I think that you would get a lot of different answers. I have heard sermons being described as being worship. Certainly people getting together and singing religious themed songs is described as worship. I've heard people getting together for a beer at a bar together with their Christian friends described as worship. I'm not kidding. It's really true. And I think that if you were to say, like, can worship be whatever you want it to be, then it seems to me that a lot of people would probably say yes, right? They would say that worship is about self-expression. And so that means then that the particular style that you use for worship doesn't really matter. There's nothing absolute that you must do in order for something to qualify as worship, right? And so if I had to give a definition for what the modern American Christian would say worship is, I would say that you could probably summarize all those definitions by saying people doing religious-looking things about their God. And what exactly is a religious-looking thing? Well, that could be whatever we say it is, right? Again, I in no way doubt the sincerity of anyone involved in any of that, by no means. But does worship actually have an objective value? Is there something that does not depend on what I prefer it to be? Because I've heard people say, again, it's a matter of taste, it's a matter of style, it's a matter of preference. So if you prefer, like there's churches that have this, if you prefer the traditional service, come at 8 a.m. If you prefer the contemporary service, come at 10 a.m., right? And which one you go to is a matter of personal taste. It's a matter of personal taste. Not a matter of any kind of objective definition of what constitutes worship, right? It's a matter of personal taste. So, okay, as a Christian, does that really work? I think a really good place to look, of course, is the Scriptures. Christians respect the Bible. Christians, teach their doctrine from the Bible. Whether you're a sola scriptura Christian or not, I'm not, because I'm an Orthodox Christian. We don't believe in sola scriptura, meaning the Bible alone, or even by the Bible alone. But whatever, all Christians respect the Scriptures and do what they do based in the Scriptures and so forth. So what do the Scriptures actually say about worship? Well, what's the first place that we see worship show up in the Bible? It's in the book of Genesis, right? So you've got Genesis chapter 4. And it actually happens after Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. And the people that we see engaged in worship are two brothers, the sons of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. And they bring different things to worship God with. Abel brings an animal, and Cain brings grain, vegetables, right? So he brings plant matter. And we know how the story goes. Abel's offering is accepted by God, and Cain's offering is rejected by God. Now, a lot of times people look at this and say, well, the reason why Cain's offering is rejected is because he didn't bring an animal, and you're supposed to bring an animal because the only right way to worship is killing an animal. I mean, if people didn't say that so often, I wouldn't even entertain that idea. They do say it a lot. And so we should just point at the fact that when God gives very explicit instructions for worship, particularly in the book of Leviticus, but also other places, it includes offerings that are not just animals. There are offerings of grain, there are offerings of cakes. And by that, I mean like birthday cake, but like, sort of flat bread kind of thing. There are offerings of drink. So it's not about animals and it's not about killing, because God accepts those offerings that are other kinds of things. But they do all have something in common, and that is that they are food. They are food. So I just want to complete the sidebar, which is, why is Cain's offering rejected and Abel's offering is accepted? Well, it says there in Genesis chapter 4 that Cain is not doing well. That is to say, he's not living his life right. And so, therefore, the problem is not what he brought to the offering table. The problem is himself. He's the problem. Right? It's not that he followed the instructions wrong, because read Genesis 1 through 3. Where are the instructions? There's no instructions on how they're supposed to be worshiping. Suddenly you just see them offering sacrifice. It's just there, right? There's no point actually in the scriptures in which worship is explicitly defined. This is what worship is. And there's no point at which it kind of gives a rationale for why you're supposed to be offering sacrifice as worship. It just simply is taken as a given, and then there's explicit instructions on how to do it and what it's for, what it accomplishes when you do it, right? So how did they know how to worship? Well, we don't know. We don't know that. But what we do know is that every single ancient culture, and indeed, almost every culture in the history of the world has worshipped its gods through sacrifice. It is universal. The idea that something else could be defined as worship is a very modern idea. And if you're a Christian, for most Christians, the idea that this central act of what it means to be a worshiper of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit should be definable by a modern idea, that's a big problem. That's a big problem, especially because there's no place in the Bible where it says worship can be whatever you want it to be, where it says it's a matter of taste, it's a matter of style, it's a matter of personal preference. Never says that anywhere. Indeed, what you get are instructions on how to do it correctly. And even in some cases, response from God, punishment from God when it's done incorrectly. Not because somebody made a mistake, but usually because they were flouting, the instructions of God. Right. So it's not an arbitrary thing. It's not a matter of personal decision. Right. So what is it about sacrifice? What's the deal with sacrifice? Why is that worship? Why is that the way that everybody worships? Well, think about it. The main thing that is being brought in sacrifice is not just animals. Remember, I said there was other kinds of stuff too, grain and drinks and cakes, whatever. It's food. It's food. So food is brought before the god, and then a part of it is offered to the god by burning it up, and then part of it is usually eaten by the people. Now, there are other kinds of sacrifices. There are whole burnt offerings, right, where all of it is given to the god, and none of it is eaten by the people. But within Israel, within the Old Testament, there's a whole system of sacrifices. So some are one kind, some another kind, and so on and so forth. Now, why would I say the god and not simply to God? That's because, again, sacrifice is universal in the ancient world. Pagans were doing it too, right? This was not something unique to pagans, and it was not something unique to Israel. Everybody was bringing sacrifices before their gods and offering them. And the big difference between them was not actually what was being sacrificed. It was not even particularly the way that it was being sacrificed. The big difference between them was the spirit to whom they were offering the sacrifice. There's a big difference between offering a sacrifice to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and offering a sacrifice to Thor. And the big difference is who is on the other end of that sacrifice. So what's the deal? Why is it food? Well, it's about hospitality. And one of the reasons we know it's about hospitality is, number one, you lay out the big spread when you're being hospitable, okay? But also another way that we know that it's about hospitality is there's actually a non-food element that is also considered to be sacrificed, and that is incense. So incense is burned within this context of hospitality. So if you're talking about the ancient Near East, which is where the Old Testament is, and the New Testament, frankly, is set. When someone would come, an important person would come, and you would bring them into your home, and you would engage in hospitality with them, one of the things you would do would be to burn incense. And burning incense creates a sweet smell. And so it makes it a pleasant place to be. But there was also a sense in which burning incense would drive away bad spirits. So it was understood to have a kind of a purifying effect. It would purify the space of the approach of bad spirits. And so one of the things you want to offer with hospitality is protection. Basically, you want to drive out the bad element, the spiritual bad element, and to make it a good place so you can enjoy the meal together with your guest. Why would you want to offer hospitality to a god? That seems kind of weird. Well, if you believe that there is a very powerful spiritual being who lives in your area, who's in your area, and has influence and control and so forth, and is dangerous, frankly, because this is a god, right? A spirit. Then you want to be on that God's good side. And so one of the reasons you would offer hospitality is to establish a good relationship with the God so that you can have this communion with them, right? But another reason why you would do it is because you wanted something from them. Right, so there's a lot of sacrifices in the pagan world in which a sacrifice is being offered to the god, specifically requesting that the god do something, like make it rain, make my wife fertile, give me victory in battle, whatever. Right, so sacrifices are offered to get something out of the god. Right, but again, this is within this context of hospitality because hospitality is usually the context in which these kinds of exchanges would occur. But also what happens with hospitality is you and the person or persons that you're engaging in hospitality with become a community together. Okay, so there's this ongoing relationship, this back and forth. And what happens in the community is that members of the community become like each other. And especially the powerful member influences all of the less powerful members. And so therefore, when you worship Ares, the Greek god of war, it is specifically because you want to be more like him. You want to be more martial. And of course, that term martial comes from Mars, which is simply the Latin term, the Latin word, the Latin name for their god of war, eventually kind of conflated together with Ares. You want to be a great warrior, you want to be martial, you worship Ares so that you can get his battle prowess, you can become like him. Right? So that's what's going on in worship is there's this offering of hospitality. There's this union between the worshiper and the one being worshiped. There's communion going on there. There's relationship going on there. There's influence. There's exchange. All of this stuff is happening within this context. Okay? Now, you might be wondering to yourself, like, wait a minute. Does that mean that every time hospitality is offered, that is worship? No, it doesn't mean that. Worship is hospitality, but not all hospitality is worship. And the reason why an ancient person absolutely would know the difference between these two things is because the hospitality that they would offer to a god would be a highly ritualized affair, right? So we actually have a kind of a basic outline of the way that worship worked in the ancient world, okay? So initially, there would be a procession with the food elements, an animal, whatever else, food elements to the place that the sacrifice is going to be offered. And as this procession is going on, there would be prayers and songs being sung. And then the animal, if it's an animal, the animal is slaughtered. If it's not an animal, there's no need for slaughter. And then these food elements would be brought to a table called a prothesis, right? And on the table of the prothesis, the priests then, who would be the ones offering up the sacrifice, they would divide up whatever the food was. So if it was an animal, it would be butchered. If it was cakes, they'd be kind of sorted out, whatever it was, right? Bits would be divided up. And then whether it's there or on the altar table, there's a little bit of variation on that point. There would also be an element that's referred to in scholarly texts as touch and elevate. So the priest would get hold of whatever the food elements were and then kind of lift it up. The idea is that it's being sort of offered to the god, okay? And then If it's the kind of sacrifice where some is given to the god and some is eaten by the people, then part of it would be taken to an altar and burned up there. And then other parts would be given to those who are going to consume it. Some parts by the priests who would always eat separately, and then the rest by whoever was offering the sacrifice, right? So this is the kind of the basic outline. And so you can see like that this is not simply what you would do if you have someone over for dinner. It's highly ritualized. So it is hospitality, but it's hospitality as to a god. Okay, it's a particular kind of hospitality is what worship is. And it's notable that a lot of this is also referred to, particularly in the scriptures, as memorials, like that memorials are being offered to God. Okay, and sometimes someone might say, "Remember me before your God," and that does not mean when you're standing in prayer, whatever, think about me, have thoughts about me, recall me. That's not what that means. Rather, it's invoke my name in prayer in the context of this sacrifice that you are making, right? And so when you get to the New Testament then, when Jesus says to his disciples, the way it usually gets translated is, do this in remembrance of me, we think, he's saying, don't forget about me when you do this. That's not what that means. It should be translated as, do this as my remembrance, do this as my memorial, because you know how to do memorials, disciples. You know how to offer sacrifices. You know what that's all about. This is the sacrifice that I expect. And it's the Eucharist that he's talking about, because he says that line in the context of the offering of the bread and the wine, which were things that were offered in sacrifices in the Old Covenant anyway. This was not some radical change. Now, there was a transformation, and we could talk a lot more about that. If you're interested in that, I recommend checking out the worship episodes that we did in the Lord of Spirits podcast. There's an episode called The Sacrifices of Righteousness. There's a one called The Priest Shall Make Atonement, and another one called Eating with the Gods. These episodes talk about a lot of those details in much greater depth, right? But so there are some transformations that happen from the Old Testament to the New Testament, but fundamentally the act of sacrifice is still exactly the same. Indeed, the order of what a sacrifice looks like that I just described to you ritually is still exactly done in the Orthodox Divine Liturgy. It's the same. Now, we're not offering prayers to Zeus or whoever along the way, definitely not, because the biggest difference between the worship of Israel, the worship of the church, and the worship of pagans is not the things that are done. It is, again, to whom they are directed. Because if you are in communion with a demon, which is what ancient Israel believed those worshipped by the pagans were, demons. I mean, St. Paul says this in the first epistle to the Corinthians. If you're worshiping a demon, then you're in communion with a demon. You become like a demon. You're becoming like that spirit. But if you worship Christ, if you're in communion with Christ, your relationship with Christ, then you become like him, right? That's why St. Paul says you cannot drink the cup of Christ and the cup of demons. One or the other. You can't do both. So it's not fundamentally like a different game is being played. It's that these are different teams playing the same game, right? The game being sacrifice, but it's not a game. But you know what I mean by that. One of the things that's explicitly not changed in the New Testament, and there's no reference to it there being changed, I should say, is incense, right? So it says in the Old Testament scriptures that incense is to be offered morning and night. And indeed, within the context of the tabernacle and the temple, the offering of incense was actually the core element of what worship is. So in the New Testament church, it kind of gets pushed a little bit to the side in favor of the Eucharist being the core element, because in the Old Covenant, the offering of food sacrifices was done to purify people so that the offering of incense could happen, right? That was kind of the ultimate intimate moment with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the Old Testament says that incense is to be offered morning and night. And indeed, in Micah 1:11, it explicitly says that incense will be offered throughout the world, right? So this is a reference to the worship of God spreading to all of the nations. So it's not just Israel. So one of the marks of Christianity is that it offers incense. There are a lot of Christians today who don't. And there's no biblical reason for them not to, and there are biblical reasons for them to continue doing that. And indeed, the offering of incense became the very basis for the two main liturgical services of the day, matins or orthros in the morning, and then vespers at night. And the main focal point of each of those services is the offering of incense. So incense is offered to God, and then the incense is brought out into the church, and the people are incensed. The worship space is incensed, or just censed. And if you incense people, that means you're making them mad. But you know what I mean. They're all censed, and that means that it's not that the incense is being offered to them, right? So like incense, when an icon is censed, or a person is censed, or the church is censed, it doesn't mean it's being offered to them. It's been offered to God already. That's explicit in the prayers. It's explicit in the Orthodox prayers. Incense that's been offered to God is now being brought out to purify the people, the space, and so forth. Right? So when you're there, when you're present there, and you are sensed, there is an actual spiritual action occurring. Right? So, and one of the things that's happening also is that the hospitality is actually in some ways being flipped. Right? We're not really offering hospitality to our God anywhere near as much as He is offering it to us. Now, this was prefigured in what was called the showbread in the tabernacle in the temple, which was that there was a separate table, that there was bread always there, and the priests ate of it. And the idea was that was God feeding His people, right? And so the Eucharist actually participates in that image as well. And incense being brought out to sense the people also participates in that as well, that this is God doing this. And that brings me to a really significant point, which is the central service of worship for the Orthodox Church is called the divine liturgy. Now, what does this word liturgy really mean? There are some people who take apart the original Greek word, which is liturgia. They'll take apart the component parts of it. There's two parts on this. One means people, and the other means work. Okay? And so then some people will say, this word liturgy, it means the work of the people. You can find this in a lot of literature, including Orthodox literature. And so someone might say, well, if it's the work of the people, then that means that the people should have a say in how this is done. This should be about self-expression. It doesn't mean work of the people. Liturgia does not mean work of the people. Liturgia actually has we would think of it as non-religious. The ancient world never thought in those terms. Nothing was non-religious, really. But in what we would call a non-religious usage, in which, let's say a very rich person decided to build a new forum for their city, right? Or build a new bath for their city or something like that. That was called a liturgia. So not work of the people. Actually, it's work for the people. It is a public work, right? It is a benefactor doing something for the public. And that is what the divine liturgy is. And who is the benefactor? Well, it's God Himself. God is the one who is doing this. Now, we do work, we do participate in it. There are things that we do in order to participate in it. But it is fundamentally an act of God towards us, right? Now, that doesn't mean that God is worshiping us when He offers hospitality to us, because again, part of worship is not just this hospitality being offered, it's hospitality as to a God. In this case, it's hospitality as from a God. And the reason we know it's that is because we are just creatures. We are inferior. He is God. He is the creator. And there is an element of our offering something to Him as well, right? So it's reciprocal kind of back and forth, right? So that's the basic shape of worship. And it's why worship matters. And it's why you can't just make something up. You can't just do it at home. You can't just go out into the forest or out next to the ocean and say, here, I'm having a big feeling, and so I worship God here better than somewhere else. Now, someone might say, now, hold on a second, Father Andrew. Hold on. What about in Hebrews chapter 13, where it says, offering the sacrifice of praise. Sacrifice of praise. Does that mean that praise is a sacrifice? Does that mean that praise functions the exact same way, that food being put on an altar, hospitality to the God, that it functions in the same way? It's not what it means. That phrase, sacrifice of praise, does not mean that praise is the substitute for sacrifices, or that praise is now the new sacrifice and everything else has been set aside. How do we know that? Well, because Christ himself said, do this as my remembrance, do this as my memorial, and he gave the Eucharist. So that's not been set aside. It's not been set aside remotely, right? That use of sacrifice and the phrase sacrifice of praise is metaphorical. Sometimes words are metaphors, and this is a case in which that is true. So essentially what St. Paul in that phrase is saying there in Hebrews is that praise functions in a manner similar to sacrifice, right? In a manner similar to sacrifice. He's not saying that this is the sacrifice instead of, because St. Paul talks about the Eucharist, right? So he's not setting that aside or throwing it away and saying, do this instead now. He's saying it's like that. And this kind of language already existed in the Old Testament. In Psalm, I think it's 140, 141, there's the psalmist says, let the lifting up of my hands be as the evening sacrifice. That's in the context in which they're still offering sacrifices of animals and other kinds of food. He said, let the lifting up of my hands be as the evening sacrifice. It's a simile in this case. Another part of that same part of the Psalms, it says, let my prayer rise in thy sight as incense. Now, it's funny, sometimes people explain that and say, oh, that means that incense is like prayer. When incense goes up, that's like prayer. That's not what the scripture says. It's actually flipped. It says that prayer is like incense, that prayer functions in a way, or at least that's what the psalmist in that particular case is asking for his prayer to function in a way like incense functions, right? So it's interesting. Prayer, praise, these things are never held up as what sacrifice is, but rather they can be used. The image of sacrifice can be used as a metaphor for how prayer and praise function. So does that mean that prayer and praise towards God is wrong? That means that we shouldn't be doing that? By no means. Of course we should be doing that. But prayer and praise by itself, without any kind of actual sacrifice being offered, which means a 3D reality of food being put on an altar, a 3D reality of incense being burned, just like we're commanded to do these things by the scriptures, by God in the scriptures, just like the prophet Micah predicts is going to happen everywhere when he's talking about incense. Without those things, it's not really worship. It's not really worship. It can be veneration, which is about showing respect and honor. And we should respect and honor God. Absolutely. So it's good. It is absolutely good. Prayer and praise towards God. These things are very, very good. And all Christians should do them. But we shouldn't stop there. We need to go all the way in regards to what worship really is according to the scriptures, according to the instructions given by God, and according to what we see the early church doing in continuity with what it says in the scripture. Sometimes people have this idea that all of that ritual that you see like in Leviticus and wherever else in the Old Testament, that's all gets pushed away and that there's some very different kind of thing that now constitutes worship in the New Testament and in the subsequent church history. That's just not true. It's just not true. Number one, you don't see that ever being said in the New Testament. But number two, if you look at the descriptions of worship that we do have in the period right after the New Testament, so for instance, in the writings of St. Justin Martyr or writings of St. Ignatius of Antioch, or anyone who talks about Christian worship, they are not talking about simply services of prayer and praise. They talk explicitly about the Eucharist. They talk explicitly about it being truly the body and blood of Christ. It's very, very clear. So this idea that worship can be anything we want it to be, even if that we sincerely want it to be, just does not square with the scriptures, does not square with the instructions of God, does not square with the testimony of the early church. So let's worship God in spirit and in truth. And that doesn't mean we can do whatever we want. It means that we do what he wants. It means that we join the testimony of the church. We join what it is that the church has always been doing. And we enter into that and we become part of it. What I want, what I prefer, doesn't matter when God has actually said what he wants. So let's do it. God bless you.